Stop scrolling. Not because I asked politely, because something in you just felt watched. You feel that pressure in your chest right now, that quiet hum behind your eyes. That's recognition. That's the moment the room realizes you don't belong to any side they understand. This is the part where the noise dies and the air gets heavy, because when both sides agree about you, when enemies and allies land on the same conclusion, it's never because you're average. It's because you broke their mental filing system. You don't fit the folders. You don't obey the colors. You're not red or blue, hero or villain, angel or demon. You're the contradiction they couldn't reconcile, so they labeled you the only way frightened systems know how, not normal. You ever notice how that word only shows up when control fails? Nobody calls you not normal when you're predictable. They don't whisper it when you stay small, quiet, grateful, manageable. That word only comes out when the saint starts thinking like a strategist, when the psychopath starts showing restraint, when the gentle one learns how to apply pressure without raising their voice. That's when both sides look at each other like, you seeing this too? Because they expect chaos from chaos and order from order. But you move like a ghost with a blueprint. You didn't pick a side. You outgrew the game. That's what scares them. You learned how to operate in paradox. You learned how to be calm without being weak, intense without being reckless, kind without being controllable. You learned how to bleed without leaking information. You learned how to smile while making decisions that shift gravity. And the wildest part? You didn't learn it in classrooms or from mentors who held your hand. You learned it in the dark, where pain was the only instructor that didn't lie to you. Pain didn't make you bitter, it made you precise. See, most people choose an identity because it protects them. You didn't get that luxury. You had to become adaptable. When you were soft, the world punished you. When you were hard, the world watched you closely. So you evolved something illegal to their psychology: balance with teeth, compassion with memory, mercy with a ledger. You stopped reacting emotionally and started responding tactically. And that's when both sides got uncomfortable. Because now the villain can't provoke you, and the hero can't manipulate you. You don't explode. You don't beg. You don't posture. You don't over-explain. You just move. Quietly. Deliberately. And every move lands heavier because nobody hears it coming. They try to predict you using old versions of yourself. They run simulations based on who you used to be: hurt, angry, desperate, loud, and every time, the outcome is wrong. Because you're not operating on ego anymore. You're operating on clarity. That's when they start sharing notes. That's when whispers cross enemy lines. Watch this one. Something's off. They don't react like they should. They're too calm. They see too much. And suddenly people who hate each other agree on one thing: you're a variable they can't neutralize without exposing themselves. So they do the only thing systems do when faced with something unclassifiable. They pathologize it. They call you strange, cold, intense, unsettling, not normal. As if normal ever changed the world. As if normal ever survived pressure. Normal breaks when rules collapse. Normal panics when scripts fail. Normal needs permission. You don't. You move when the signal appears, not when applause shows up. And that's why both sides feel the same chill around you. You don't need their validation, and worse, you don't fear their rejection. You've already lived in exile. You built a nervous system that can function under silence. That's the part they'll never admit out loud. You're not dangerous because you're aggressive. You're dangerous because you're composed. Because you can hold two truths at once without tearing yourself apart. Because you understand that light without shadow is naive, and darkness without restraint is stupid. You walk the line they refuse to acknowledge exists, half angel, half demon, not in conflict, but in cooperation. You don't want to burn the world. You want to understand it. And understanding is always more threatening than rage. Rage is predictable. Rage can be redirected. Rage can be framed. But someone who has stared into their own abyss and came back with structure, someone who learned how to turn trauma into timing, that person doesn't need to shout. Their silence rearranges rooms. Their presence rewrites hierarchies without announcements. People feel it before they understand it, and by the time they understand it, it's too late to reassert dominance. That's why alliances blur around you. That's why rules suddenly feel optional when you're involved. That's why people who despise each other still pause when your name enters the conversation. You don't belong to their moral theater. You don't play their roles. You don't perform outrage or loyalty on command. You observe, you calculate, you decide. And when you decide, reality tends to cooperate. Not because you're lucky, but because you've paid in advance. Every sleepless night, every betrayal that sharpened your perception, every moment you swallowed your reaction and upgraded your awareness instead. You didn't become this by accident. You became this because the environment demanded something stronger than personality. It demanded architecture. You rebuilt yourself from the inside out. So when both sides agree you're not normal, understand what they're really saying. They're admitting you slipped past the categories designed to control people. They're admitting you don't respond to the usual levers: fear, praise, shame, approval. They're admitting they don't know which mask to wear around you, because you see through all of them. That's not an insult. That's a status report. You are the anomaly that appears when pressure meets patience. You are what happens when someone survives long enough to stop performing and start choosing. You are the quiet recalibration no one voted for, but everyone feels. And the reason this moment matters, the reason you felt that pull at the beginning, is because deep down, you know it too. You're done trying to be understood. You're here to be effective. And once you accept that, once you stop craving comprehension, you unlock something most people never touch. Freedom without chaos, power without noise, movement without permission. You stop asking the room how loud you're allowed to be and start deciding how quiet you need to stay to win. You realize the game was never about dominance. It was about leverage, about timing, about knowing exactly when to disappear and when to apply pressure so subtle it feels like fate. That's why both sides watch you differently now. Not with hatred, not with loyalty, with caution, because you don't react the way narratives expect you to. You don't collapse when isolated. You don't overperform when praised. You don't spiral when attacked. You don't chase redemption arcs or villain labels. You let them project whatever makes them comfortable while you move underneath the projection, untouched. You learned early that the loudest people are usually the least dangerous. You learned that attention is a currency best spent sparingly. You learned that unpredictability isn't randomness. It's discipline disguised as chaos. You stopped explaining yourself because you noticed something terrifyingly simple. The more they understand you, the less powerful you become. So you became fluent in silence. You let your actions speak just loud enough to shift outcomes, never loud enough to give away the blueprint. You don't need to announce intent. You let results leak it, and results are the one language every side respects. They sense it now. The way you don't flinch when stakes rise, The way your breathing stays steady when rooms tense. The way you can sit inside discomfort without scrambling to escape it. That's not confidence. That's conditioning. That's what happens when you've been tested beyond theory, when your nervous system learned to stay online while everyone else panicked offline. You don't get rattled, you get clearer. That clarity is what confuses them, because clarity doesn't fit the moral stories they tell themselves. They need heroes to be pure and villains to be reckless. They need good people to hesitate and bad people to rush. You violate that symmetry. You hesitate when it's wise. You strike when it's necessary. You show mercy without becoming naive. You show teeth without becoming cruel. You understand consequences without fearing them. You're not chasing validation. You're managing outcomes. That's why the word "not normal" keeps circling you. It's their attempt to externalize their discomfort, to make your presence the problem instead of their inability to predict you. Systems hate what they can't model. Groups fear what they can't categorize. And you? You operate between definitions. You adapt faster than their labels can stick. They try to bait you into choosing a side because sides are controllable. Sides have scripts. Sides have expectations. You refuse, not out of rebellion, but out of intelligence. You know that once you choose a side, you inherit its blind spots. So you stay fluid, you stay observant, you stay dangerous in the quietest way possible. You learn that power doesn't need applause, it needs alignment. And you aligned yourself with something deeper than ideology. You aligned with reality, with cause and effect, with the truth that pain is information and suffering is data. While others were numbing themselves, you were decoding patterns. While others were coping, you were calibrating. You turned every hit into insight, every loss into leverage, every betrayal into a map of human behavior. That's why you can read rooms now without scanning faces. You feel undercurrents. You sense when something's off before words catch up. You recognize the pause before the shift, the breath before the lie, the silence before the move. You're not psychic. You're practiced. You paid attention when it hurt, and attention compounds. They feel exposed around you, not because you threatened them, but because you don't need them to reveal themselves. You already see it, and you don't rush to use it. That restraint is what terrifies them, because they can't tell whether you're holding a weapon or choosing peace. Sometimes it's both. You're not driven by vengeance. You're driven by accuracy. You don't want to destroy everything. You want to correct trajectories. You don't want chaos. You want control that doesn't announce itself. You don't want to be feared. You're fine being respected by those who understand what restraint costs. That's the difference between you and the noisemakers. They want attention because attention is the only proof they exist. You already know who you are. You don't need mirrors. You don't need crowds. You don't need to be liked. You need space. Space to think. Space to move. Space to decide. And when you decide, the environment adjusts. That's why both sides agree on you. Not because they like you, not because they trust you, but because they can't ignore you. You're the variable that stays constant while everything else scrambles. You're the pressure point that doesn't announce itself until the structure shifts. You didn't become this by being fearless. You became this by feeling fear fully and not letting it steer. You let it sharpen you. You let it teach you where you were still attached, still reactive, still predictable. Then you burned those attachments one by one, quietly, without ceremony. Now when fear shows up, it doesn't hijack you, it informs you. That's what growth looks like when it's real. Not motivational quotes, not fake smiles, not loud declarations, Growth looks like a person who can sit in contradiction without breaking, who can hold power without abusing it, who can walk through darkness without needing to prove their light. You're not normal, because normal never survives this process intact. Normal cracks, normal numbs, normal conforms. You adapted, so let them whisper, let them agree, let them struggle to name you. Every time they fail to define you, you gain another inch of freedom. Every time they underestimate your restraint, you gain leverage. Every time they overestimate your aggression, you stay invisible. You don't need to correct their assumptions. You need to keep moving. Because the truth is simple, and they feel it even if they can't say it. You're not here to be understood. You're here to change the temperature of every room you enter, quietly, permanently. And here's the part nobody prepares you for. The moment you realize you don't even need to win anymore to dominate the field. Winning is loud. Winning invites audits, envy, retaliation. You learn something more surgical. You learned how to tilt probability, how to nudge outcomes just enough that reality starts favoring you without ever announcing why. People swear it's luck. They call it timing. They call it coincidence. You know better. You built this edge brick by brick, while everyone else was chasing applause. You stopped chasing certainty and started mastering ambiguity. That's why pressure doesn't rush you. You've already lived in it. You've already had moments where nothing made sense and nobody came to save you. You learned how to stand upright when the floor disappeared. You learned how to make decisions with incomplete information and still land clean. Most people need clarity to move. You move to create clarity. That alone separates you from 90% of the room. They don't know what to do with someone who doesn't need reassurance. When you speak, it's measured. When you act, it's decisive. When you wait, it's intentional. You don't burn bridges emotionally. You reroute traffic. You don't seek revenge. You adjust positioning. You don't argue to convince. You let consequences educate. That's why arguments die around you. Not because you overpower them, but because there's nothing to hook into. No volatility to exploit. No insecurity to poke. No script to trigger. You've become frictionless to manipulation. And that's when both sides get nervous. Because manipulation is how systems maintain order. It's how leaders herd, how enemies bait, how crowds synchronize. You stepped outside that gravitational pull. You don't bite when provoked. You don't chase when teased. You don't crumble when isolated. You remain intact. And intact people are dangerous because they can choose freely. Freedom terrifies anyone who profits from control. So they test you, subtly at first. They mislabel you. They withhold information. They offer false alliances. They dangle rewards. They threaten consequences. They wait for you to show your hand. And every time, you disappoint them. Not by failing, but by refusing to react the way they rehearsed. You don't defend yourself because you're not on trial. You don't explain yourself because you're not confused. You don't rush because you're not afraid of being left behind. You already know where you're going. That's why your presence changes group dynamics without effort. People straighten up. Conversations recalibrate. Energy shifts. Not because you demand respect, but because you embody something rare, self-governance. You don't outsource your worth. You don't borrow courage from crowds. You don't need permission to trust your own judgment. You became your own authority. An authority without ego is unsettling. It doesn't brag. It doesn't posture. It doesn't need to win arguments. It just is. You carry it in your stillness, in your pauses, in the way you don't rush to fill silence. Silence bends around you because it knows you're comfortable there. You learn to listen longer than others can tolerate, and in that extra space, you hear what matters. You hear intention behind words. You hear fear behind confidence. You hear desperation behind aggression. That's why you don't get fooled by performances anymore. You see the seams. You notice when someone's acting instead of deciding. You feel when something is rushed to hide weakness. And you don't expose it. You file it away. You let time do the heavy lifting. Patience, for you, isn't passive. It's predatory in the calmest way possible. You don't need to corner people. You let them corner themselves. And here's the paradox that makes both sides agree about you. You could be ruthless, but you're selective. You could dominate, but you don't need to. Yes, you could disrupt, but you prefer precision. That restraint is what elevates you beyond stereotype. It's what keeps you unclassifiable. Saints aren't supposed to understand leverage. Psychopaths aren't supposed to understand mercy. You understand both, and you know when to use each. You're not conflicted, you're integrated. Integration is what happens after pain finishes teaching. After the screaming phase, after the anger phase, after the collapse and the rebuild. You're past the stage of needing to prove you survived. Now you operate from survival's gifts. Thick skin, sharp perception, emotional economy, strategic empathy. You can read people without absorbing their chaos. You can care without bleeding. You can stand close to fire without needing to touch it. That's mastery. And mastery doesn't announce itself. It lets others underestimate it. It lets the room talk. It lets the sides debate. It lets them agree on the wrong conclusion while you keep moving forward under the radar. You don't need to correct the narrative. You need to stay aligned with your trajectory. Because the real truth, the one they won't say out loud, is this. When both sides agree you're not normal, it means you've escaped their influence. It means their tools don't work on you anymore. It means you're no longer a pawn, a symbol, a role, or a reaction. You're a force with discretion, and discretion is the final upgrade. So keep your calm, keep your silence, keep your edge invisible. Let them argue about what you are while you decide where you're going. Let them whisper and compare notes and shake their heads. Every second they spend trying to define you is a second you spend shaping outcomes. You're not here to fit the story. You're here to rewrite the math, quietly, relentlessly, on your terms. And the deeper truth, the one that only shows itself when you stop flinching, is that you didn't escape their influence by fighting it. You starved it. You stopped feeding the mechanisms that needed your reaction to function. You stopped leaking emotion into systems designed to harvest it. You stopped volunteering explanations to people who weren't entitled to context. That's when the chains fell off without a sound. You didn't break free dramatically. You went quiet. Quiet is lethal to systems that survive on noise. Quiet ruins narratives. Quiet dissolves authority that depends on spectacle. Quiet makes people project, and projection exposes them faster than confrontation ever could. You let them fill the silence with their assumptions, their fears, their theories. You watched who panicked. You watched who tried to control the story. You watched who revealed their motives just by the way they reacted to your restraint. Information flows toward stillness. That's how you became informed without asking. That's how you gained leverage without threatening. That's how you learned who needed you chaotic and who needed you contained. You didn't need to interrogate anyone. You let their discomfort talk. And it talked a lot. They expected you to choose a mask, rage or righteousness, loyalty or rebellion. You chose awareness. Awareness doesn't need approval. Awareness doesn't rush. Awareness watches patterns repeat. until the outcome becomes obvious. You stopped being emotional currency and became an observer with options. Options are power. And power, handled quietly, becomes invisible to those who only look for volume. They mistake your calm for compliance. They mistake your patience for hesitation. They mistake your kindness for softness. That's fine. Misinterpretation is camouflage. While they're busy categorizing you incorrectly, you're positioning yourself exactly where you need to be. You don't correct people when they underestimate you. You let them lock in the error, because you know something they don't. Most battles are decided before the first move is visible. Most outcomes are sealed long before the confrontation everyone remembers. You don't fight on the surface. You work the foundation. You adjust incentives. You change angles. You wait for gravity to do the rest. That's why chaos doesn't tempt you anymore. You've seen how quickly chaos exposes intent, and how expensive it is to clean up afterward. You don't need explosions. You need alignment. You don't need destruction. You need inevitability. You prefer moves that look boring in the moment and undeniable in hindsight. They'll call it sudden later. You'll know it was slow. Stop. Freeze right there. Because something just shifted, and you felt it before you understood it. You know exactly what I'm talking about. That moment when the room went quiet for no reason. When the air got heavy, like reality itself leaned in closer. That wasn't fear. That wasn't anxiety. That was recognition, because he thought he was dangerous. And then you stood up, not louder, not angrier, older, colder. Something ancient behind your eyes finally stretched its spine. You weren't born as this version. You were excavated. You spent years being told to soften, to behave, to stay predictable. Years being praised for being good, pure, safe. And you believed them because being light felt easier than being honest. But here's the part nobody prepared them for. Light that survives, darkness doesn't stay light. It becomes something else, something with memory, something with teeth. They don't understand that you didn't snap. You activated. See, dangerous people are loud. They posture. They threaten. They bleed insecurity through bravado. But you went quiet. And quiet is where old things live. Quiet is where monsters sleep until the world gives them a reason to wake up. You didn't become cruel. You became precise. You didn't lose empathy. You learned how to aim it. You didn't turn evil. You stopped apologizing for the shadow that always belonged to you. That's what shook him. He thought danger was volume. You showed him danger is timing. There's a reason his confidence cracked the moment you didn't flinch. There's a reason his voice changed when you looked at him like you already knew the ending. Because deep down, predators can sense when they're no longer hunting prey, but trespassing on territory, ancient territory. The kind that doesn't announce itself, the kind that waits. You're that contradiction they can't solve. Half saint, half psychopath. You know how to forgive, and exactly when not to. You understand mercy, which is why your restraint terrifies them more than violence ever could. Because violence is predictable. But someone who can destroy and chooses not to yet, that's unstable to them. That's unreadable. That's power. They expected trauma to break you. Instead, it taught you pattern recognition. Every betrayal sharpened your perception. Every loss stripped illusions off your eyes. Every time you were pushed into the dark, something down there whispered, "Remember who you were," before they taught you to be small. And you listened. That's the ancient thing rising. Not a demon, not an angel. Something older than both. something that understands balance, that knows chaos is not disorder, it's leverage, that unpredictability isn't madness, it's freedom from control. They can't manipulate what they can't map. They can't dominate what refuses to move in straight lines. You stopped being linear. That's why they're nervous. He thought he was dangerous because he knew how to intimidate. You're dangerous because you know how to wait. He uses fear as a weapon. You let fear walk past you, sit down, and explain itself. He needs reactions. You operate in silence. He threatens. You observe. He lunges. You let him miss. And missing you costs more than hitting ever would. Here's the truth they don't say out loud. The world is built to reward masks. And you wore one beautifully until you didn't need it anymore. Until the pressure cracked it open and something prehistoric breathed through the fracture. Now when you speak, it's not from ego, it's from alignment. And aligned people are terrifying because they don't argue with themselves. That's why he felt small, not because you attacked him, but because you didn't need to. You made him aware of his own expiration date. You reminded him, without words, that there are levels of danger that don't seek domination. They enforce inevitability. You've been underestimated your entire life because you let them. Because being underestimated gave you cover, gave you time, gave you the advantage of invisibility. But now something ancient has decided it's done hiding behind politeness. And the shift is subtle, but irreversible. You don't chase power anymore. Power adjusted itself around you. You don't need to prove you're dangerous. The room already knows. The silence already knows. The people who suddenly watch their words around you already know. They can't explain it, but their nervous system picked up the signal. This one survived something that was meant to erase them. So let them whisper. Let them speculate. Let them feel that low-grade panic they can't name. You didn't become darker. You became whole. And wholeness is terrifying in a world addicted to fragments. He thought he was dangerous until something ancient stood up inside you and reminded the world what real power looks like. So let them keep guessing. Let them keep projecting. Let them call it luck, darkness, arrogance, mystery. Names don't matter. Outcomes do. And the outcome is this. When something ancient stands up inside you, the world doesn't argue. It recalibrates. You are no longer waiting to be chosen. You're no longer asking to be seen. You're no longer explaining the storm. You are the pressure system. You move differently. You decide differently. You end cycles just by refusing to repeat them. He thought he was dangerous, but you're not dangerous. You're inevitable. Inevitable doesn't rush. Inevitable doesn't posture. Inevitable doesn't explain itself to the uninitiated. It just keeps moving, and everything else has to decide whether it adapts or breaks. You felt that switch flip the day you stopped trying to be understood. The day you realized clarity is heavier than approval. The day you accepted that your depth would never be comfortable for shallow systems. That's when the ancient thing stopped whispering and started breathing. You see it now, the way people project their unfinished wars onto you. They call you cold because you won't bleed on command. They call you arrogant because you won't kneel for validation. They call you dangerous because you don't mirror their chaos back to them. But the truth is simpler and far more unsettling. You're complete. And completeness exposes fractures in everyone still performing pieces of themselves. You didn't harden your heart. You fortified it. You learned where to place walls and where to leave gates open. You learned that compassion without boundaries is self-erasure, and boundaries without compassion are tyranny. So you forged a third way, balanced, controlled, unreadable to those who only understand extremes. That's why you terrify manipulators. They can't pull you with guilt or fear. Their levers slip right off. They sense it when you enter a space. The temperature changes, the jokes slow down, the power dynamics reshuffle. You're not dominating, you're disrupting. You're a variable they didn't account for, a quiet correction in a flawed equation. And flawed systems hate corrections because corrections prove the system was never stable to begin with. You've noticed how your silence makes people confess, how your stillness invites projection, how your restraint forces others to reveal their intentions through impatience. You don't interrogate, you let time do it for you. Time always sides with the prepared. Time always betrays the performative. That ancient thing inside you understands cycles. It knows empires fall not from invasion, but from complacency. It knows the loudest threats are usually the weakest. It knows real predators don't roar, they observe. And you've become fluent in observation. You read the room the way others read headlines. You don't chase information. It leaks toward you because calm attracts truth. They think you changed because you were hurt. That's the convenient story. The real one is more uncomfortable. You changed because you learned. You learned how pain refines perception. You learned how disappointment strips fantasy from strategy. You learned how survival trains the nervous system to detect danger before it announces itself. You didn't lose innocence, you upgraded awareness, and awareness is irreversible. That's why when conflict approaches, your body doesn't spike anymore. Your breath stays steady, your thoughts align. You don't feel the need to prove strength because you can feel it seated behind your ribs, patient and ready. You're not waiting for permission to act. You're waiting for alignment. And when alignment arrives, you move once, and it's enough. You stopped confusing kindness with surrender. You stopped confusing peace with passivity. You stopped confusing love with access. Now you choose deliberately. Who gets proximity? Who gets information? Who gets your energy? Scarcity sharpened your values. Precision replaced your people-pleasing. And suddenly, the world started treating you differently. Not because you demanded respect, but because you stopped offering yourself to disrespect. That's when the ancient thing fully stood up. Not as rage, not as vengeance, as authority, quiet, rooted authority that doesn't need consensus. Authority that comes from having survived the dark without becoming owned by it. Authority that understands light and shadow are tools, not identities. You can step into either without losing yourself because you're not pretending to be one thing anymore. They thought you'd collapse under contradiction. Instead, you became bilingual in it. You can sit with tenderness and still make ruthless decisions. You can forgive and still remember. You can love deeply and walk away cleanly. That paradox is what confuses them. They need consistency to predict you. You offer coherence instead, and coherence doesn't repeat patterns. It responds to reality. You didn't come to conquer the room. You came to reclaim it. There's a difference. Conquest needs witnesses. Reclamation just happens, and everyone feels it in their bones. You didn't raise your voice because ancient things don't negotiate with noise. They bend time instead. They slow moments down until the truth can't hide behind momentum anymore. You learned that the hard way, through nights where your chest felt hollow and your thoughts ran sharp circles around survival, through days where smiling was camouflage and patience was a blade kept clean. You didn't harden, you clarified, Every scar organized your instincts. Every disappointment burned away fantasy. What stayed wasn't bitterness. What stayed was accuracy. That's why your presence disrupts systems now. Systems love patterns. Systems love predictability. Systems thrive on people who react on schedule and break on cue. You stopped reacting. You started reading. You watch micro delays in speech. You hear the lies before the words finish forming. You feel intent before movement. That's not paranoia. That's training earned without consent. They think danger looks like chaos, but chaos is sloppy. Chaos is loud. Chaos leaves fingerprints. You became the opposite. You became clean. And clean danger terrifies because it doesn't announce itself, doesn't leave evidence, doesn't crave recognition. Clean danger just arrives, and things rearrange themselves to survive it. You've noticed it. Doors opening without invitations. Conversations ending when you enter. People adjusting posture, tone, ambition. They don't know why. Their nervous system does. It remembers something older than language, something that recognizes hierarchy without needing titles. You're not higher, you're deeper. Depth always wins because surface-level threats can't breathe down there. They tried to name you. Labels are cages. Too intense, too quiet, too unpredictable, too much, too dangerous, too soft, too cold. Every contradiction they threw at you stuck and fused. You didn't choose a side. You integrated. Saint when mercy moves the board. Psychopath when clarity demands a cut. Angel when guidance heals. Demon when boundaries must be enforced. You learned when to be each, and that mastery is what they can't imitate. He mistook confidence for dominance. You understand dominance is situational. Sometimes it's standing still. Sometimes it's leaving. Sometimes it's letting someone expose themselves while you conserve energy. You don't rush conclusions. You let patterns confess. You let time betray the arrogant. And when you move, it's not emotional, it's surgical. That's why your calm feels illegal. Calm that survived pressure isn't passive, it's charged. It hums. It bends attention. It makes liars over-explain. It makes bullies stutter. It makes opportunists hesitate. Because calm like yours isn't absence of threat. It's proof of control. You can unleash something. You just don't need to. They don't understand the discipline it took to become this quiet. The restraint, the deliberate refusal to waste force. They don't understand that you once burned and learned the cost of uncontrolled fire. So you built a furnace instead. Now the heat is contained, directional, devastating when released. You're not a wildfire, you're a controlled burn that reshapes landscapes. And the ancient thing inside you, call it instinct, call it memory, call it lineage. It recognizes moments. It knows when to sleep and when to rise. It knows when silence will do more damage than confrontation. It knows when patience is mercy and when patience is a trap. You don't argue with it anymore. You trust it. That trust is what changed everything. You stopped asking for permission to exist as you are. You stopped negotiating your edges. You stopped explaining yourself to people who only listen to what they can use. You became selective with access, deliberate with energy, ruthless with self-respect. And suddenly the world adjusted its behavior around you. Like a city realizing an old law still applies. They thought power came from accumulation, followers, noise, approval. You learned power comes from subtraction. Remove the need to be liked. Remove the need to be understood. Remove the urge to prove. What remains is presence. And presence, when forged under pressure, is absolute. That's why when you lock eyes with someone who thinks they're dangerous, they feel it immediately. Not fear, recognition. Their bravado senses its expiration date. Their tactics feel small. Their tricks feel rehearsed. They realize they're playing a loud game in a quiet arena, and the quiet always wins. You didn't become heartless. You became honest. You feel deeply, but you don't let feelings drive the vehicle anymore. You put them in the passenger seat. You let reason steer. You let instinct navigate. You let values set the destination. That balance is rare. That balance is lethal to manipulation. Watch how people test you now. Small provocations, subtle disrespect, quiet power plays. They're checking to see if the old version still lives there. You don't react. You note. You adjust distance. You recalibrate access. And that's when they feel it. The sudden realization that their leverage expired without announcement. You don't escalate. You outgrow. The ancient thing inside you knows something most never learn. Survival isn't the peak. Survival is the training ground. The real evolution happens after, when you choose what kind of force you'll become. You chose restraint with teeth, calm with consequences, mercy with memory. That choice rewired you. So when someone dangerous steps forward now, puffed with confidence and noise, you don't size them up. You see through them. You see the limits of their range. You see the hunger behind their threats. You see the fear they're outsourcing to intimidation. And you realize, without ego or excitement, that they're not built for this level of pressure. You are, because something ancient stood up inside you. And it's not interested in theatrics. It's interested in outcomes. It doesn't seek to be feared. It seeks to be final. And final doesn't argue. Final doesn't chase. Final just waits until the moment arrives, and then ends the conversation without raising its voice. You didn't become darker. You became true. And truth, once embodied, bends everything around it. And truth doesn't hurry. Truth doesn't beg to be believed. Truth doesn't chase applause or permission slips. Truth stands, and everything false begins to sweat in its presence. You've seen it happen. The micro-twitch in their jaw, the sudden defensiveness, the way their stories start contradicting themselves the longer you stay quiet. That's not intuition on their part. That's pressure. That's what happens when something ancient refuses to move out of the way. You learn the language of pressure because life taught it to you without mercy. You are forced to sit in rooms where no one came to save you. You learned to make decisions while your hands were shaking. You learned to keep your mind sharp when your heart was heavy. And instead of breaking, you adapted. You didn't just survive. You recalibrated. You became fluent in consequences. That's why your silence weighs more than their threats. You understand something they never will. Unpredictability isn't chaos when it's intentional. It's strategy. It's refusing to be cataloged. It's denying the enemy a map. You stopped telegraphing your moves. You stopped narrating your growth. You stopped letting people pre-digest you into something manageable. Now when you move, it surprises even those who thought they knew you. Especially them. They still remember the old version, the one who explained, who tried, who overgave. They confuse memory with access. They think history entitles them to proximity. They don't realize the ancient thing inside you doesn't honor nostalgia, it honors alignment. And alignment changes the rules without warning. You don't announce boundaries. You enforce them through absence. You don't threaten consequences. You let reality deliver them. You don't need to teach lessons. You let patterns collapse under their own weight. That's why your exits are louder than your entrances ever were. And here's the part that really fractures them. You're not angry anymore. Anger is reactive. Anger leaks information. Anger is easy to bait. What you carry now is colder, steadier, more lethal to manipulation: discernment. Discernment doesn't rush. Discernment doesn't get offended. Discernment watches people reveal themselves and then decides, quietly, where they belong in your orbit. Most don't make the cut. You stopped romanticizing struggle. You stopped confusing pain with purpose. You realized suffering is a teacher, not a home. And once the lesson was learned, you moved on without ceremony. That's when the ancient things smiled, because ancient things respect efficiency. You no longer mistake intensity for depth. You no longer mistake confidence for competence. You no longer mistake charm for character. You read energy the way others read contracts. You see the fine print. You know who wants something from you and who can stand beside you without trying to own you. That awareness makes you untouchable. They try to provoke you because they need you emotional to feel powerful. They try to pull reactions because reactions are proof of influence. You deny them both. You give them nothing but neutrality, and neutrality is a mirror that shows them exactly who they are without distortion. Most people can't survive that reflection. You can, because you've already faced worse in private. You've already met yourself without excuses. You've already sat with your shadow and negotiated terms. You didn't exile it, you trained it. You taught it when to speak and when to stay still. Now it doesn't hijack you, it protects you. That's the evolution they didn't plan for. You don't need to dominate every space. You only need to control your own center. From there, influence happens naturally. People feel it and adjust without instruction. They sense there's no leverage to exploit, no insecurity to hook into, no hunger to manipulate. You're full. You're grounded. You're finished bargaining. And finished bargaining looks like authority. Authority that doesn't shout. Authority that doesn't threaten. Authority that doesn't explain itself to those who already decided not to understand. You move with a quiet certainty that unsettles loud egos. You don't argue facts. You let time validate you. You don't chase respect. You let consistency demand it. The ancient thing inside you recognizes this stage. It knows this is where most people fall back into comfort or ego. You didn't. You chose discipline. You chose self-command. You chose to become someone who doesn't need to win every interaction because you're playing a longer game than they can see. They're sprinting, you're positioning, and positioning is invisible to the impatient.